we wanted to go on to one of our next co-innovation sessions, the regulatory environment for novel space tech. And with that, I want to introduce Ilsa Mroz, who is a senior manager of Space Systems Division at the Aerospace Industry Association. In this role, she works with AIA members to support and advocate for relevant industry issues in civil, commercial, and national security space. And she also oversees policy initiatives. She's going to be moderating this co-innovation session along with and joined by Dr. Diane Howard, who is the Director of Commercial Space Policy at the National Space Council in the Executive Office of the President. Also joined by Dr. Erin Vaughan, leading the Prometheus Reentry Testbed at Space Vehicles Directorate, Air Force Research Lab, and Josh Martin, who is the VP for Government Affairs for Varda Space. Now, I want to tell you all again, the QR code here is where you could go add any kind of inputs. The folks here will sort of talk about this. They're going to co-innovate on this issue of the regulatory of novel space, and then we'll share some of the inputs from the survey for you all to keep discussing. So, thank you.
Everyone hear me? Excellent. Good morning, everyone. So I want to start off with just a huge thank you to Casey, to New Space Nexus for inviting us, for hosting us, to all of you for being here, and for all of our panelists for joining us today. As Casey said, my name is Ilsa Mroz. I'm the Senior Manager of the Space Systems Division at AIA. I'm also, of note, a UNM alumni, so very happy to be back in Lobo territory. Everyone's a Lobo. Happy to be back, and I've been consuming an amount of green chili that is physically possible but not advisable. So to start us off, I do want to spend a few minutes setting the stage. So I will go down the line momentarily, but I do really want to lean into the Socratic method that these co-innovation sessions are pushing. So please take advantage of the survey, because I do want to have a robust discussion here. So to start, novel space is probably one of the sexier parts of our industry, and it covers a massive amount of different issue areas. Working with Aerospace Industries Association, I have a really good vantage point of the scope of these issues. We work with over 300 member companies and nearly 2 million workers across the aerospace and defense supply chain. So we're very close to our members who are endeavoring for novel space technology, and very close with our government partners who are helping to regulate it. So I would like to start, Diane, with you, and get a quick download, go down the line here from each of you on what, from your perspective, from where you sit, what is the current state of novel space tech regulation? And I'm not good at dodgeball, so I'm going to refrain from going too deep into mission authorization. I will let Diane cover that one. I'm within arm's reach, so I'm going to stay over here.
Figure this out. You hear me? Yeah, there you go. All right. So for our intents and purposes in the government, we've been defining novel activities as the things that aren't directly regulated right now in space. And so I don't want to give the impression that we're not overseeing, authorizing any activities. We are, but it's rather ad hoc. And that became an environment of uncertainty, and it was really becoming not just difficult for the private sector to deal with, but also very difficult for the government. So when we started looking at exactly, what the buckets included, they're pretty straightforward: launch and reentry, spectrum, and remote sensing of the Earth. And so instead of trying to drop down into lists of things which become obsolete almost as soon as you make the list, we said everything else. So that was our starting point. The other thing that we decided to take a look at was, first of all, that, we're not just talking about authorizing, we're also talking about some modicum of supervision, because, if we start with our Article 6 obligation under the Outer Space Treaty, it says authorize and supervise, which can mean many, many things. The The next piece of that is there are policy things that we've had in our regulatory processes, and the way we deal with how the government has dealt with private sector activities back since 1958, before there was even an outer space treaty. So those kinds of policy things are like safety and the fact that we do consider national security, that we do consider our foreign policy interests, things like that. So that was our starting point. We had many meetings within the interagency. I, come from academia, so I really approached this like a classroom situation, which was a little bit unusual, I think, for some of the interagency. But there has been a lot of work that's been done on this particular trade space, if you will, for more than a decade. And so I thought, we should start with an understanding, a literature review and an understanding of the context in which these things have happened. And some of that resulted in a legislative proposal back in 2016 that never went anywhere. Which really was focused on sort of extending the payload review. It was only focused on authorization. In the time ensuing since then, we've really all kind of gotten on the space sustainability bandwagon, understanding that if we don't have something that's sustainable, then our business models cease to be relevant at all. And we really do have difficulty with the domain as any kind of domain, warfighting or other. And as a result of that, we decided that we needed to look at what the current state of our statutory authorities allowed us to do. And we realized that there was not a lot. This is why we started with the legislative proposal back in 2016. That said, it is not a climate where we can count on anything moving rapidly through the congressional process right now. And so we, in National Space Council, were insistent that we should look at what we would want in a legislative proposal to address this everything else. But what are the things that we could do with the statutory authorities that existed in the executive branch that we could implement now and that could get us ready so that we could be scalable, like Bucky was talking about, so that we could sort of future-proof what we were doing. So we took a bifurcated approach. We did it, took it twofold. I will say something I said in our earlier session today. It's a very emotional issue. First of all, industry doesn't want to get over-regulated. That said, we understand that. That said, also government doesn't want to be irresponsible. So, there's a lot of emotion in how to do this. And then, yesterday in my talk, I talked a little bit about all the different departments and agencies that are part of our National Space Council. There are quite a few government users of space. And then there are several regulators of space, one of which is independent. That's the FCC. So how do you respect all of that? And there's, as I said, a lot of emotion. There were some very well-developed ideas of where things should go and how they should be done. When we do things in the federal government and when we do things at the White House, we do them by consensus. And so we have to honor all those equities that exist by statute or by mission mandate. And also the interests that come out of that. And that is not an easy process to get consensus. The more equities and the more interests you have, the harder consensus is to achieve. So we basically said to the big contenders, commerce and transportation, you need to figure out how you can work together. So I loved Bucky used the phrase competimes, and I think that kind of is relevant here, because it is all teamwork. So the current state right now is that we have these buckets of very directed authorities within commerce, transportation, and the FCC. We have a legislative proposal that we presented to Congress on November 15th, which very clearly delineates the roles and responsibilities between commerce and transportation. And it includes a third part, which codifies the things that are implicit in the fact that Congress has been funding commerce to do the space situational awareness transition from DoD. And so it codifies a lot of those activities and also spells out how that's all going to be handled. And then it talks about the things that commerce and transportation will do. And in a nutshell, transportation would continue its work with human spaceflight safety. So anything that touches humans and their safety would be transportation responsibility. And in-space transportation, which I think is a sticking point for many. So I'm just going to kind of give you, it's like a delivery. It's not just things that move in space. If it's moving to perform a service, that is not a transportation function. But if it's delivering, goods from Earth to the ISS, and then from the ISS going to a commercial LEO destination, that would be a function of transportation. Anything else, if it's going and it's taking, fuel from a fuel depot and then, going and actually performing a fueling service, that would be the Department of Commerce. And we think that that's pretty clear. Sometimes it requires a little bit of explanation because it's not what people were expecting, but that's where that is. However, that is kind of in sort of congressional limbo right now. So what are we doing in the interim? Well, we on December 21st introduced our framework for novel activities. And that is all the things I told you we insisted upon. Things we can do now. We, by consensus, came up with some very good principles that say, whenever we look at these activities, we should be considering, along with national security and safety and foreign policy interests and international obligations, we should also be looking at sustainability, space sustainability, and that there's things, national interests that we should think about as well. National interest is defined elsewhere in what we, presented to Congress. It talks about things like planetary protection and just things that don't really fit into any of the buckets, but we have a national interest in being concerned with. And then there are also some roles and responsibilities in there, and we have moved out on those. So we're working on that. The last thing I want to bring to your attention is all of this that I just described to you is available online, very easy to find. Google National Space Council, you'll get our webpage. And then at the bottom, you're going to find links to all of the things that we've put together in this particular administration. So the Space Priorities Framework, the legislative proposal, the sectional analysis, and the framework. Thank you.
Thanks, Diane. And then Josh, before I head over to you, I just wanted to share a takeaway that I've had over the last couple of days at this conference has been the value of the micro and the macro perspectives on these issues that I've really been able to take away from so many of the private companies as well as our government partners. So something that I want to make sure that we keep in mind as we go through this panel is that you're considering both sides and both perspectives, because that's something that has been hugely valuable to me and something I want to make sure that I'm sharing with the rest of you. So Josh, over to you.
I think from Varda's perspective, I think one of the things that has gone well this year was the fact that we were able to obtain a license from FAA and approval for our reentry range to conduct our successful mission with Winnebago 1 in February of this year. I think that is proof, that a novel reentry approach will not be barred by the laws of man. If we can achieve it, through the laws of physics and science, that law and regulation will not inhibit this type of activity. I think one aspect of though is I think a concern of whether or not it's scalable, over time. Whether or not a commercial operator like us can operate, under the time scale, that is applied to us by our regulators and our range supporters as we're trying to meet, public and private customer demand. We work very closely with Dr. Vaughan and her team at AFRL on some very important projects. And I think trying to tackle that issue of scalability and repeatability so we can achieve low cost, high cadence, access to microgravity and reentry tests.
I'm going to follow on with the same subject. Okay. Yeah. So a couple of things. I think there's some mixed messaging happening on the commercialization front from the program side. And I've definitely heard this from Dr. Howard's talk and other folks in the room. We want these companies to be commercially independent. We want them to have stable commercial business because as we know, government funding is intermittent. It's not reliable. Sometimes, interests change. And we don't want these companies to be dependent on the government to support their capabilities. Because then when we come back in 5 years and say, oops, we still want that, we don't want that company to be gone at that point. So So that's great. That's what we're trying to push on the program side at AFRL through the Strat5 program and partnerships with NASA and other government organizations, leveraging the venture capital funding that the companies have raised, and building this multifaceted approach to incubating a capability. That's great. I think that that's the right approach from the program side and from the business side. But then when we turn around and we work with the regulation agencies and the test ranges, and the government organizations that support those, we find that they are deprioritizing exclusively commercial activities. And so they say, well, that we're not going to support just commercial. If there's not a defense mission associated with it, then it's not something that we're going to entertain at all. And so that's a completely mixed message that we're sending to the companies. And so I think what we need to do is change the attitude and the culture within the regulation and the government agencies that support the ranges and that sort of thing, so that we can all be on the same page and supporting these companies to become stable and independent and successful outside of the government.
Thanks, Erin. Diane, you made a comment that I kind of wanted to pull on that thread real quick before we get into our comments here that I can't actually see. But you mentioned making sure that we're future proofing. So with novel space tech, everything was novel once, and there are going to be new novel technologies that we don't know what we don't know. What is the best way to future proof from your perspective, and how do we harmonize that between government and industry?
So, I mean, we've been talking about things that there's an ongoing process. We heard it in Travis's talk. We also heard it when Bucky said things that were once upon a time unicorns aren't now. And so it really requires mechanisms for the conversation so that we can continue to process and the way we begin that is through understanding what's even out there. So that's one of the things that we included in the framework, is that there's what I call the knowledge repository. It's gone through many iterations of description, but one of the principles is that the U.S. government has it benefits from knowing what all those technologies are, and not so that it can regulate, but so that it can know what it can benefit from. But also eventually, if this is going to become a commercial endeavor, it's going to require some sort of authorization process, some sort of supervision process. So in the framework, we created a steering group. And it's an interagency steering group, so it's a government steering group, but there are many places within the framework where there is interaction contemplated and relied upon with the private sector. And when we talk about the private sector, we're not just talking about industry, we're also talking about NGOs, and we're talking about academia, because we just want all the great minds to be involved. And that steering group is not a consultative process for a license. That steering group is so that we can get ahead of the curve and start, okay, now we have this knowledge repository. We know that these are the capabilities that are either being developed, they're in development, or they're going to be developed. And then we can start to map the expertise that resides within the U.S. government, because if it doesn't live within the Department of Commerce or NASA or transportation or DOD, it might reside somewhere else. I mean, there's a lot of places, and our whole goal, rather than coming up with a one-stop shop, we came up with this. Well, you know what? It's a whole of government approach, because we can't even contemplate all the things that we may need. So we want to have access to everything that's already available in the federal government. So that's our approach. That's how we think, and we think that that's a modular thing, as we start to develop. So kind of, it has to be a little bit loosey-goosey in order to be able to be malleable and modular. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. Did either of you want to tack onto that? All right, makes that easy. So shifting over to some of these comments, I can't read the question at all. But what I can see is the reassessing the ITAR and EAR regulations. So I know that this has been a hot topic in industry, especially over the last year or so. I assume this is what's been done. Is that what's been done well? I'm sorry, can you read? Gotcha. Thank you. And I also have 20/20 vision, cannot read that at all. So to start with the top one, would love your take on how our ITAR, EAR export control processes have been reassessed lately. Would love some initial thoughts.
Should really go.
Do it.
I think, so, just to provide context, can you hear me? Provide context, we conducted our first our Winnebago 1 landed at the Utah Test and Training Range. Because range diversity is very important to Varda. We assessed other ranges and settled on a secondary range in Australia at the Kaniba Test Range. It's in South Australia. And so for future missions, we have also been working with the range personnel and a company called Southern Launch that operates in that part of Australia. And so as a U.S. Commercial space operator, we have had to work through some of the ITAR and EAR requirements and regulations. I will say that the Department of Commerce has been very good to work with in that respect. I think with Diane and Chirag's work at the Space Council too, and negotiating a recent bilateral agreement with Australia through the Technology Safeguard Agreement, that has made that process much smoother. I think we are also very excited about the recently passed language requiring the Department of State, recently passed language in the last year's National Defense Authorization Act, requiring the Department of State to evaluate other technologies that you can eliminate, or streamline ITAR requirements with the UK and Australia under the AUKUS agreement. So Australia is a great partner for us, and we think that the recent NPRM from the Department of State on this particular topic is very positive, and I think moving in the right direction to work with a partner like that.
I'm hogging the show. So there's more. So yes, that's like the first piece. We got tasked by the vice president back in December of 2023 to revisit export control regulations, which stalled out in 2019. There were some personnel changes, COVID happened, there was lots of other stuff going on. But, the last reform was 10 years ago with export controls, and then there was a real good effort in 2019 and it went nowhere. And a lot of things have happened since 2019. The world looks a lot different. Space, the low Earth orbit looks a lot different. Everything looks a lot different. So she tasked us with modernizing the export control. So this AUKUS NPRM that came out, AUKUS-related NPRM that came out as a piece of it. Another piece that is related to it was the change in the way we interpret some of our commitments under the MTCR. So do not encourage, and that was announced by Deputy Secretary of Commerce Don Graves in March of 2023. So we're continuing, and there's a lot of work that's been going on inside the government. NSC is pretty much leading that effort, but working with state and with everybody who has any hand in national security on this, how we interpret our commitments under MTCR. Another piece of it is the lists from the USML to the CCL, and that work is ongoing right now. And I know Chirag made an announcement at Symposium about this. So we expect that we're going to know which things are going to move and the rationale underpinning what those moves are. And again, just like, not making lists of things, it's not very constructive, but instead understanding how we classify these capabilities in a way that can be rationalized and scalable for the future. And we should have that within, I think the date is June 17th, so within a month from now. And then you will see that followed up by an NPRM. And lastly, if we get to it, and I hope that we do, I really would like us to take a look at the review process when a company gets a commodity jurisdiction decision that they don't agree with. I would like to see some sort of more transparency than we have now.
Thanks, Dan. So on the, and we're moving. So real quick, so that second point, this is a theme that I've heard kind of over and over again in the last few days here from all of you, keeping up with the speed of progress and advancement and making sure the regulatory environment is keeping up with that speed. So I think the kind of catch and release of the timeline that I've been seeing a lot, from the holistic industry perspective has been interesting and occasionally alarming. But it's encouraging to see how much thought is going into keeping up, and on both sides, from industry and from government. So I'd love to get your thoughts, especially, Dr. Vaughan or Josh, if either of you have, from the other side of the perspective. I love you, Diane, but
I'm going to
pass
start and I'm
off.
going to
Go
hand
for
it to Josh. First of all, I wish you went faster. I mean, I get frustrated because I haven't been in government so long that I'm calcified and I'm constantly just cracking the whip, giving out homework. But I want to just point out, I mean, Josh, Varda has been really great about coming and knocking on our door. And I mean, I am accessible and I'm pretty responsive. And if you have a problem, let us know because we can light the fire and maybe make it go faster. I wish I had a better answer than, this is kind of a one-off solution, but that is working. So.
Everything Diane says is true. Yeah, I think, a fast-moving company like ours is always going to push, the bounds of regulator timelines to meet our customer needs. And, sometimes those things collide. And I think, I have to give FAA, for instance, FAA some credit, and that the team at AST is working hard to address some of these constraints that keep them from moving as fast as I think industry would like them to go. Resourcing, is a particular, problem in terms of their ability, to apply resources, to review applications, to review safety data. It is a real constraint, and then the iterative process between regulator and industry, just creates more time. And I think the FAA is trying to squeeze down a little bit on that iteration so that industry understands more clearly what the regulator requires, and that the industry partner can provide that. So from a people power, piece of the equation, they need they need higher headcount. I think, the FAA is also looking to do things to streamline application processes through, an online electronic, portal, take some of this workflow between the regulated operator and the review team, out of email, for instance. I mean, so simple things like that, which should squeeze, some time out of it. I think ultimately what, an operator like Varda, ultimately wants to achieve or get to is an operator's license. So we're not doing one-off, single mission licenses every time we approach our regulator or our FAA regulator, and that there is an accepted they have accepted our methodologies and how we approach our mission and review our safety, the safety aspects of our operation. I think they are trying to get to that point. I think that's a pretty tall amount of work, but we're confident that we can get there with the FAA soon. I think, the other piece, certainly is, the FCC, and some of the things that they are looking to do in the future related to in-space manufacturing and sort of the spectrum needs, for novel space operators. I think the approach, thus far, I think is one that, we believe is somewhat sound. And that they're thinking about this, clearly, but, clearly that's more of a future solution, future problem issue than right now. But the time frame that we operate under right now with regulatory review, it does not sufficiently, meet our commercial or our government, partner needs currently.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything that was said. I think, Josh is exactly right. The resourcing problem, it would be great if that could be solved. I think across the government, everyone is stretched thin. So that's a problem that affects every organization as far as I can tell. So I don't know that that's a problem that's realistically going to get solved. You know, as part of the Prometheus project at AFRL, we've partnered with Varda, but we're also incubating a handful of other companies to develop similar technologies. And one of the first pieces of advice that I give them is start the regulatory process now. And they're like, well, we're years away. I'm like, no, start now because it might take that long. And even so, you know, you mentioned that there's the online portal for starting the application process. You know, I had to shepherd a company through that process, and they waited months with no response. I had to reach out to my contacts over there at the FAA, and they gave me a couple of names to email directly to check on the status of that application. There was no response there. So it seems like they're trying to put in these additional you know, time saving or efficient processes in place, but they're not really panning out to perform in the ways that I think they were intended to perform. You know, it took me reaching out a third time to my contact at the FAA and saying, look, these people are not responding. And then finally a connection was made between this company and the FAA, you know, after months of my active engagement and going in between. And I don't mind doing that, but I don't think that that should be the answer. You know? So yeah, that's kind of been my complaint there as far as moving quickly. I think we are starting on the government side. I think we're starting to do a better job at working with companies and thinking about the transition plan. And Bucky talked about this during his talk too. That's a hugely important piece of the puzzle. And I don't think on the government side we are educated enough on what transition means and what the transition paths are. And when we talk about novel technologies, there often isn't a transition goal that's even identified yet. So we're sort of paving the way and figuring out what the future home is going to be for some of these technologies as we're building it together. So, but I think the answer there is to work really closely between the government and industry, be kind of working hand in hand on both sides of the fence to develop, you know, the home for that future technology and talking with the different you know, services and agencies that might benefit from that technology and building the collaboration and making sure that everyone is in lockstep as we work towards establishing a capability both for commercial industry and for the government.
So my takeaway from that plays into this next point in bold, as well as something that we touched on in the working group this morning. If any of you were in that working group this morning, I apologize if any of this is redundant. We were just dress rehearsing. And that's on, so clarity and communication. So something that I've noticed just from my conversations here is that there seems to be in some ways a bit of a communication issue in our industry. And that's not to say that we're not always talking to each other, because we are. Everyone is constantly blowing up each other's phones. We're, Omar made the right phrase the other day, sliding into the DMs at all hours of the day. We're always talking to each other, but somehow we still have these communication issues that get brought up in these panels, in these working groups. So I'm curious to kind of pull on that thread a little bit and get your takes on where do you perceive that barrier to be? Where in, you know, between point A and point B might that issue be, and how do we tackle that?
Well, first of all, communication is bidirectional. So I think we have to kind of take a look and make sure that when we're communicating, we're not simply transmitting. We have to get, you know, some sort of acknowledgement that, you know, what we transmitted was received and that it was received in the way that we meant to transmit it. So I think that that's maybe one of the things that's happening. And you know, there was another thing that came up in our dress rehearsal this morning about translation. So that I think that kind of fits with making sure that what was heard was what you intended to convey. It's true. Communication is a big part of it. And part of it is being honest and being straightforward. So I'm saddened to hear about your experience, Erin, because that's a long time. I will say that the FAA hasn't put into a place yet its new improved digital application process. So I think whatever you're encountering and experiencing is in the older system, and there is something better that's coming, which will communicate with and be interoperable with the system that that Department of Commerce is putting in place for its regulatory processes. So I think that might help. But the Department of Commerce also, in addition to being regulators and providers of SSA, they are also industry's advocate in the executive branch and ombudsman, and that term came up in the dress rehearsal also. And yes, they are the advocates. So I would also invite you to engage with the Department of Commerce Office of Space Commerce and say, yo, can you help these people? Because they're not getting anywhere. So I think, you have an arsenal. You just take out every different, magic trick in your backpack and you try it.
I would add that, greater clarity is also important. And I think the example that, that I'll use, again, I'll go back to our Winnebago 1 reentry. Coordination with range assets and our regulators wasn't always very seamless. And I think right now, too, because reentry or launch, at interior, test ranges or spaceports is a fairly new activity. A framework, that, delineates what the Department of Defense's, roles and responsibilities and the regulatory roles and the civil regulator it does not really exist for that type of activity currently. And we've seen though how launch operations at federal ranges on the eastern and western at Vandenberg and the Cape have benefited from that sort of clarity. And I think that's certainly something that I've talked to Diane about, and that's something that we talk to our friends at the FAA and the Department of Air Force about. Is the need to say, all right, you have this, new novel, space capability that's available to you that you can leverage for, your Department of Defense needs. However, a higher prioritization and a framework, should be implemented to make sure that that local range commander understands the risk assumption, that they may be signing up for, for a particular operation. And it's clear who owns, which piece of the operation and the review of that particular operation. I think that's probably one specific area of needed clarity, going forward. So.
Yeah, I'll just kind of piggyback on that a little bit and say that, in our experience during the phase between launch and eventual reentry of the Varda capsule, we had a lot of periods of complete silence from the range and the FAA. And some periods of a lot of, hurried, rapid, urgent activity leading up to some deadline. And I know that's typical of government to do anyway, but it's frustrating when we feel like we're wasting a lot of valuable time in the interim. That's one complaint. Another area where I noticed some issues was that there appears to be some sort of level of distrust between the government and commercial. So I don't know. I imagine there's a historical reason behind that. I haven't been in the government long enough to have experienced that myself. I imagine I'll be burned at some point, but right now I'm still very optimistic and trusting of my commercial partners. Varda has been exceptional to work with. And so to hear from, the government representatives from the ranges and from the FAA to say, no, we need to keep these conversations private. We need to keep them government only. We can't talk to the companies about this. And I'm thinking, why not? Why can't we share with them what the problems are so that they can address them? Like, what is the big secret? Why can't we work together to address the elephant in the room or to solve the problem that needs to be solved? Like, they're not trying to trick us. They want to get their capsule back too. Nobody is trying to be malicious here. So.
I actually have a response to that because I am a pretty straight up and transparent person, but I have had to say many times, we're not ready to talk to you yet because of that consensus process that I talked about before. So sometimes the reason for that isn't distrust, it's that things are still deliberative. And I mentioned that there's a lot of interests and equities that are, in existence in different places in the federal government, getting those reconciled so that you actually do have a unified response that's not going to change next week, takes some time. And so it isn't necessarily distrust, it's more like process. So I mean, I trust industry. In fact, I'm very much a believer in trying to do things to facilitate wonderful things coming to fruition. That said, I also know that we have, as government people on the government side, we have a responsibility to be responsible. So I think it's, kind of balancing those interests and understanding that sometimes process takes time.
Yeah, I understand. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for clarifying that. I do appreciate that as well. So thank you.
Well, I could talk about this all day, but Casey's going to come and chase us off the stage. So I will wrap us up just with some parting thoughts that there's really incredible work being done in this industry, as is demonstrated. There are incredible minds that are putting in this work. There's incredible work to be done. So please continue to engage with us throughout the rest of this conference. We're really looking forward to it. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to each of you. This was wonderful. And thank you, Casey. Go eat some green chili.